Hello, fellow rebel capitalists. Hope you're well. Got my good buddy here, Chris Irons from QTR Podcast. We were on Twitter this morning going back and forth. I have a couple disagreements. We got different views on certain things, and it's a hot topic, Russia and Ukraine. So we wanted to come on here and just discuss things live, and hopefully we can give you guys some value by hearing some of our insights. So Chris, I'll let you start. What's your position on what's going on right now with Russia, Ukraine, and what I think, I'm not going to say more importantly, but almost as important with what's going on with the media?
Well, the disagreement that we're having, which, I don't even know how much of a disagreement we're going to have when it comes down to brass tacks here. But what happened was Tim Poole posted on his Twitter a comment about a German translator who was translating Zelensky's speech a couple of days ago. And there was an article written about how the German translator, while she was translating the speech, broke down and started, getting emotional in the midst of translating his speech. And Tim Poole, and I like Tim Poole a lot. I think he's a good journalist. I think he makes a lot of sense. I love hearing him on Rogan. I listen to his podcast. But Tim posted that and basically put up a caption that said something to the effect of, "You're being manipulated by the media." And, I pushed back on that. And I just said, not everything is media manipulation. Nobody is more skeptical of the government than I am. Nobody's more skeptical of the mainstream media than I am. You and I have talked about COVID ad nauseum, the way that it's been handled, the messages that we were fed, the lies that we were fed, versus the reality of, what we found out about the vaccines, what we found out about the virus, the origins of the virus. And this has been happening a lot over the last couple of years. It happened with the Hunter Biden laptop story, where the media just refused to report on it at all. And so I'm a firm believer in looking at both sides of the coin. With Ukraine and Russia, U.S. intel was saying there was an imminent invasion coming over the last couple of weeks. And I was skeptical of that too. I didn't say it wasn't going to happen, and I didn't say it definitely was going to happen. I said, here's what needs to be looked at, right? And I brought up little things like the EU didn't withdraw its ambassadors at the same time that America did. I said, okay, maybe they have different intelligence. But on the other hand, hey, there's satellite imagery of 150,000 troops on the Ukrainian border. So how do you ignore that? Who do you trust? Do you trust U.S. intel one time and then not again? Do you trust them this time? Is it wrong to be skeptical? Is it right to be skeptical? And, all of these little instances, COVID and the Ukraine invasion together, because I think that's kind of what he's playing off of, they're different events. They're being reported on differently, and they need to be treated a little bit differently. And so, once the invasion started to happen, and I'm sure you're not going to push back on the fact that Russia has in fact invaded Ukraine. Once that started to happen, then it became a question of, all right, I guess my beef with what Tim said was, I think he's right a lot of the time that we are being manipulated and that the media does have an agenda and does have a narrative. But in the specific case where he's talking about a German translator who broke down and started crying, saying that was being fed to us as, a manipulation story, probably comparatively to COVID, with the story of the nurse saying, people are begging me for the vaccine while they're dying. You're probably trying to elicit that same kind of emotional response. But on the other hand, objectively, what's happening here is, you have what I think is a mostly unprovoked war, and we can talk about that, provocation, not provocation. That the point is Russia, invaded Ukraine. There was no, they didn't even stage a good false flag to lead up to it. They just went in. And so one day Ukrainians were getting up and going about their business and, going to work and cooking breakfast. And the next day they were defending their capital city from tanks and from, fighter jets and missiles. And so the point is that I think all these little instances need to be taken with nuance and they need to be examined individually on their merits. I've gotten a lot of shit from people over the last couple of days for not just towing the it's the government's fault, the CIA is trying to create a narrative, the mainstream media is trying to create a narrative, they're trying to lead us to war. I've gotten a lot of shit for just coming out and saying I support the Ukrainian people because, again, you could talk about historical provocation and NATO, and you could talk about moving nukes into the region, and you could talk about whatever you want to talk about. But this doesn't happen if Russia doesn't stack the border with troops and then invade the country, right? Invade the sovereign nation. And so, what I've seen from the media, you're always going to get stories of, look, do I think the German translator who broke down crying about the atrocities of war and President Zelensky begging for help as his country's invaded by the Russians, do I think that was a fake story? Not necessarily, because to me, it's more likely than not that it isn't, because I've had moments myself.
I don't think Tim thinks it's fake. I didn't take his tweet that way.
Okay, so the only point that I was trying to make is that, I don't vote all the way down the, deep state party line or against the deep state party line. And I've seemed to have offended a lot of people over the last week or so by simply saying that I support the Ukrainian people. I did a little thing with my blog where our subscribers, we raised some money to send to the Kiev Independent, which is a journalism outfit, and another organization, I think it was called CARE, that was, supplying people with the necessary things that they needed in Ukraine. And I caught a lot of shit for that because people say, "Oh, how can you buy it? How can you buy the narrative?" It's like there's nothing to buy. Maxar satellite imagery shows a line of tanks 17 miles long heading into Kiev, right? I mean, we can see the live video streams of Kiev as it's bombarded with missiles. Innocent people are dying. So I'm not saying send American troops. I'm not saying we need to get grossly over involved. I'm definitely not advocating for World War III. Your response to my tweet to Tim basically saying, oh, the media is pushing for World War III. All I've heard about in the media is people talking about how they want peace. And so maybe I'm missing something. But again, I think when you're examining all these things, you have to look at them individually. You can't just say it's all one big conspiracy by the deep state, because believe it or not, and trust me, I'll be the first to admit that, I know there's a lot of bullshit. I know there's a lot of, in history, there's been a lot of false flags. In history, there's been a lot of lies, but not 100% of it. 100% of it isn't bullshit. And I look at these things individually and I examine them, critically, I think on a case-by-case basis. And here, there's still things I'm skeptical of, but I don't think it is a grand conspiracy to manipulate the psyche of the country into getting into World War III, which is what Tim and maybe what you think is going on.
Yeah, I think there's a high probability. I wouldn't go so far as to say that the media or the World Economic Forum or the IMF started the war, but I do believe that they would want to take advantage of the crisis. And I think that the media, although like COVID, although they might have reported it accurately, they would say, and it is true, but the way they present it, it's done in a way where they try to get you as emotional as possible. And my point that I've tried to make on Twitter is we're dealing with someone with 6,000 nuclear weapons.
Right.
This is not the time to be emotional. And if the media is trying to get us emotional, we need to step back and say, we're not going to allow them to do this. No matter how many people you see crying. I went to the CNBC homepage today, and you see kids being trucked out of Ukraine on some sort of train. It's horrible. I mean, absolutely horrendous. And I'm not saying it's not true, but I'm saying don't allow the media to suck you in emotionally, so we have a greater probability of going to World War III and or nuclear war, which could wipe us all off the face of the earth.
Well, I don't disagree with that. And, I've probably seen some of the same video clips that you have, notably one I saw yesterday of people trying to leave Kiev, right? Everybody trying to board a train. altogether, and people trying to squeeze as many people. I think they were going to Poland or somewhere, but just trying to get the fuck out of Kiev. And, at some point, though, that's reality. That's what's happening over there. So,
It is, and I'm not
what's
saying
the
they're not.
difference between reporting that objectively and just saying, here's what's happening there
Well, look at what
versus,
they did with COVID, Chris. You brought up a great point
but this
initially,
isn't COVID.
but they're doing the same thing. They're in my opinion, they're reporting the facts. It is true, but they're doing it in a way to get you as emotional as possible. And the more emotional we are, the worse decisions that we are going to make
I
in
agree
a
with that.
situation that is highly, highly tumultuous.
Sure.
This is Saddam Hussein and Iraq. This is a dude, and if the narrative is correct that Putin is, if he is crazy, if he is absolutely out of his mind, then what that would also lead you to believe is that if this does move further, and if people do get emotional enough to support the United States going to war, that will end very, very, very badly. And and I think another great point that you made is that the level of emotion that you're seeing on your Twitter feed when you do something just so simple as try to raise money for people who are suffering this humanitarian crisis that we should all be opposed to. And I've experienced the exact same level of emotion on my Twitter feed when I'm saying, hey guys, we need to think through this. This is a complex situation, and let's not let the media get us over emotional. We can't even explore the idea of diplomacy because we are so pissed off at every single Russian, at every single person that we believe is the exact same as Putin, that now all of a sudden we've taken this tumultuous situation and exacerbated it even further to a point of no return.
Yeah, but I think that we're doing everything that we can do to try to deal with this in a diplomatic way. And you can call it what you want. You can call it cowardice that Biden doesn't want to step in and, whatever, declare a no-fly zone over Ukraine. You can call his sanctions not enough. But the action that the world has taken that you called this morning cancel culture, you
Mm,
said, oh, it's cancel culture on the Russians. And I said, it's not cancel culture. It's not a 19-year-old trans activist complaining about their pronoun and trying to get your coffee shop shut down because you won't serve them. It's the modern world saying to Russia that they don't accept what Russia's doing, and they're going to try to cut ties economically, mostly economically, but in some cases politically, and just try to make life as miserable for Putin
not,
without
not
without a hot
life,
war.
yeah, but make life as miserable as possible for Russians. They're
It,
they're they're
it does,
they're
right,
they're they're saying that we should kick Russian students out of universities. We
but
should kick we should ban Russian performers from performing in New York City.
the
We should
point of that is
ban 16, 17-year-old kids from going into the junior Canadian hockey draft. And with this is a slippery slope that well. This takes us straight to the camps that we saw with the Japanese in World War II, where we are trying to dehumanize people. We're trying to lump them all into a group.
no.
And that is a very, very, very
I
dangerous
don't. I
situation.
don't think that's what's happening. I think
That
what's
is exactly
happening
what.
is
How could you not see it as this, Chris? And also, too, once I'd love to hear your response to that, but then let's think through what the efficacy of this is. It's just like the
sure,
unvaxxed. It's just like saying, well, what we're going to do is we're going to set up a vaccine mandate, and it doesn't have any health purposes. It's just to make the vaccinated's life as miserable as
right,
possible, to force them to go get a vaccination. It's the same
right.
argument. You want to make the Russians' life as miserable as possible, even though they have nothing to do with this. So they'll go back to Russia and try to somehow protest against Putin or try to vote him out of office. That's insanity.
Nobody is making Russians' life more miserable than Putin is. he's torpedoing the country's economy single-handedly, and he's torpedoing Russia on a global stage single-handedly. And Russian citizens are going to have to deal with the consequences of that, for years. Look, the option is strategically, what do? Do we provide military support? Do we do nothing at all? That's an option, right? Which ostensibly would, and there's no good solution here, right? But do we do nothing at all, which is an option that could embolden him militarily and say, well, fuck it, I'm going to take Ukraine. I'm also going to take Poland while I'm right here too, because nobody seems to care, right? We can do what we're doing now, which is enforce sanctions and fight what is really an information war too, because Russian citizens are being told one story about what's happening, while the rest of the world is seeing it in a completely different light. You have suffering that's going to occur for Russian citizens economically, and you're also going to have Russian lives lost. The military that's being sent into Ukraine. It's a humanitarian crisis too for the families of soldiers that are being led into this under false pretenses. I've heard that they're being, sent there being told one thing, and then they arrive there and they find out, oh, well, this is why we're actually here. And there's Russian lives that are going to be lost because of this too. And those lives will be somebody's son or somebody's daughter, somebody's family member. And so the idea of the sanctions, I think, is to create enough discomfort, I would say, if I had to guess, to create enough discomfort that the populace starts to understand that something is wrong. The world is not perceiving these events the same way that we are. And it's not just the United States. This isn't the Japanese camps at the United States. This is the entire world. This is the most of the free world. Okay, the US, all of our allies, the European Union, pretty much everybody except for China. India has kind of stayed on the fence a little bit. But with the exception of those two countries, the entire world is unified.
Yeah, just like the war with vaccine mandates.
Yeah, but right. But you have to look at the situation we're in and the options that were being given. And what can we do aside from doing nothing, aside from trying to sanction things so that because what will happen is war protests are already breaking out in Russia, right? So the Russian citizens are going to feel the consequences of what's going on economically, and that is Vladimir Putin's fault. That's not the rest of the world's fault. Every action had a reaction. Putin invades Ukraine, so now, all right, well, we're going to sanction Russia economically, right? And so they will feel the brunt of that. The world, which is essentially the market, if you want to call it the market, has decided they no longer want to do certain types of business with Russia, so they're not going to. So that will have a negative effect. And eventually, I think what will happen as a cause of that, or what's bubbling up in Russia, will be the citizens' distaste for the actions that its government has taken. At some point, the citizens of Russia, and they already have, are going to point directly to Putin and say, you fucking got us here. This is the mess we're in, And so I think you're right. I think part of it is a slippery slope, but there's no real good solution. And we're trying to walk a very thin line here to, achieve a desired result without being emotional, without flying off the handle, without nuclear weapons happening.
Right. But so we don't want to make matters worse. And I don't think that destroying the life of a 16-year-old kid that just happened to be born in Russia, that's trying to compete in a hockey league in Canada, is making the matter better. I think it's
you can't. You're not going to be able to individually examine the consequences for every single person of Russian ethnicity or companies that do a bit of business with Russia, but don't do a bit of business with Russia. What's that?
So you don't do it at all. It's the same argument of McCarthyism. Back in the day, you could say, well, there were certain Russian individuals in the government, right? But what we don't want to do is send 10 innocent people to prison just to find the one person that's guilty.
Right, I agree with that.
That's not what we want to do. And that's
right.
What we're
that's
doing.
Why we have innocent until proven guilty, right?
That's why we're banning, but that's the point here. We're banning all of these Russians, and I think it's going to go further. I think that this is just the beginning. Once we start to dehumanize people, like I believe we're doing with the Russians right now, again, this is a slippery slope that we
How
don't want.
about the Russians' dehumanization of the people in Ukraine?
But that's not, just because hurting Russians doesn't help Ukrainians.
Yeah, but there's a huge difference between banning a 16-year-old from a hockey tournament and somebody having to defend their city from missiles when the day prior all they had to do was get up and eat a.
How does banning how does ruining the life of that 16-year-old Russian kid in Canada help the Ukraine situation?
First off, it doesn't ruin his life. Okay, let's just have a little perspective. Okay, if a missile hits your house and kills you and your family, that ruins your life. If you can't play in a hockey tournament and you're 16 years old, that's an inconvenience, but it doesn't ruin your life. And
No,
people aren't being dragged out into the streets. What's that?
Yeah, they're not allowing them to participate in the draft, and they're proposing to kick Russian students out of university. And
Right,
this is just the beginning, Chris. This is just
the
beginning. It's going to get worse.
Listen, it is what it is right now, and I think the desired result from that is that is going to again bubble up amongst the people that it affects, right? Who then have to look at their leaders. They have to look at their government.
Chris, let's think this through.
Sure.
Let's just assume that we're in Russia, and let's just assume it's 50-50. Let's assume 50% of the people agree with Putin, and they have taken they've digested the propaganda,
right.
or as we see the propaganda, and then you've got the other 50% that, let's say, oppose Putin. Okay, great. So now we're going to go ahead and let's go back to this example of banning Russian kids from universities. Okay. So or let's just say banning a Russian team from playing in a specific soccer tournament.
Right, the World Cup, yeah.
Yeah. So how is that going to affect the psychology of the 50% of the people that agree with Putin or agree that Putin should have gone into Ukraine? That will make them dig in even further.
Sure, but do you think 50?
And there is the other 50% that don't like Putin. It's not going to make them dislike him anymore.
That's not true.
It's not going to make those protesters that are protesting the war protest harder. It's all you're going to do is shoot yourself in the foot. It's the exact same thing as the virtue signaling that was going on here in the United States, or still is, with the athletes taking a knee at the beginning of some sort of football game.
Yeah, but
you're not making the problem better. You're making the problem worse.
First off, there's economic consequences to like removing Russia from the World Cup, right? It's not an empty gesture, right?
Let's look at the university students and the 16-year-old hockey players.
Sure.
Because it's the same slippery slope that once you start banning them from tournaments, although there may be an argument there, the next thing is the hockey player. And we're just talking about this. I guarantee, Chris, when we revisit this in 2 weeks or a month, that the attack on innocent Russians is going to be far, far greater than it is right now today. This is going to get worse. It's not going to get better.
Listen, the attack on innocent Russians, as you call it, pales in comparison to the actual physical.
It does, but two wrongs don't make a right, Chris.
I understand that. But the world has to do something. We have to make some kind of collective statement. And, the statement isn't that like Russians are evil or Russians are dirty or all the things that you were implying this morning on your tweet stream. There isn't a collective hatred out there about Russians or, Russians. Certainly that's not my point of view.
We're on. I'm trying to look out 2 months, 3 months.
That's
the direction we're going, and I'm trying to get people off that path.
I understand what you're saying. You're saying it's a slippery slope. I get it. And that at some point, the Russians will be vilified and innocent Russian citizens. I talk about this all the time when I talk about all the dog shit US listed China based companies that are on US stock exchanges. And I always qualify it by saying I've worked with Chinese nationals and I think they're wonderful people. And it's a country full of, great people. It's just the leaders in charge that are the problem, right? So you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. But on the other hand, we have to do something, right? The world has decided, the modern world has decided that they need to react to this in somehow, and there's a line that needs to be walked, and that's where you and I meet, because probably we agree on a lot of things about this, right? We probably agree that we both want peace, right? We probably agree that we don't want the situation to escalate, right? So there's probably a lot of like main key points that we agree on. It's just trying to walk up to this line of, the Laffer curve, if you will, of effectiveness of what can we do to try to show Putin that, we can posture and that we have some backbone, and if he wants to take Poland, that there will be consequences, without escalating the situation. And I think that there's been innumerable chances for diplomacy, even leading up to this, starting with President Zelensky saying off the bat with 200,000 Russian troops on his border that, oh, he doesn't think that they're going to invade, and that the media was escalating the situation right from the start. His comments were aimed at de-escalating, and there's been all of these waypoints along the way where diplomacy has been encouraged. Putin spoke with Macron today. I mean, he told Macron to go fuck himself, but there have been continued olive branches that have been extended to him to give him an opportunity, but he has his mind made up. And what he has decided is that he's going to just reach out and just take over a sovereign nation that a couple weeks ago was operating normally. And so there has to be a reaction to that of some sort, whether or not it's a global reaction or it's just a reaction from Ukraine. There needs to be some type of reaction. Otherwise, he just starts absconding with pieces of the free world and there's no consequences for him. And so the question is, where do you meet that? Where do you find that thin line to have a reaction, but to not escalate the situation and to do the least amount of harm possible to people that are, innocent Russians and innocent Ukrainians and, innocent people around the world, right?
Yes.
And so there's nothing that I've seen so far that has led me to believe that we have overstepped that line, or that we're doing something that has been, flying off the handle or emotional. And I take your point. We don't want that to happen. And I think you're right. And I think it's important that that gets brought up. But the idea that we're being manipulated into World War III, when the only thing I've seen in the media is constant pleas for peace and de-escalation, the two things just don't gel, together with me. And that's, I guess we just...
Yeah, so a couple things here. Number one, we totally agree on the problem. I think we just slightly disagree on the solution.
Right.
Or the solutions that they're trying to, the sanctions, I totally get it. You got to do something. I get it. I just don't think that what some of these, and they're not being forced by the government to my knowledge, but some of these other institutions, and who knows why they're doing it, virtue signaling. I think this is what's wrong. But I think that's a result of the media trying to get us more emotional than we otherwise would be. And this is my fear. And I think this is the greatest danger, because I do think that if calmer minds prevail, that we can figure out some sort of diplomatic solution that does not involve the United States going to war with Russia. Because if that's what happens, again, you're dealing with someone with 6,000.
Right. It's a huge problem.
Not just a huge problem. We're talking about wiping out humanity, possibly.
Right.
Here, especially if he is insane. Right. So that's what we want to be.
Which all signs point to he is. I mean, people that are bureau chiefs in Moscow that know him closely, that have followed him for decades, have said he's off. He's lost it. They've never seen him like this.
Yeah. Again, is that the media? I don't know. I don't know. None of us really know. But I think the first thing that
I don't know. But when you look at a guy like Max Seddon, whose job for the Financial Times is to just be parked in Moscow, and his finger is on the pulse of the Russian government, and he has, he's got a seat at the Kremlin. He's watched every press conference for the last X amount of years. And I've seen numerous people like Max Seddon, and there's other people that I've started following on Twitter. And I've gone back and looked at how long they've been covering Russia and covering the conflict. Many of these people, were around in 2014. They were around in 2008. who have said that they've never seen him like this. That was the reaction after he gave that speech. Also, that like,
which is another reason why we should not be getting emotional.
I agree. But should we not report that?
But we should do it in a way, or we should, as a citizen, we should at least be cognizant.
Oh, did I lose you?
That this is. Are you there? Shoot. Let's see. Are you there, Chris?
Oh yeah, sorry, lost you for a second.
Yeah, I think it's my internet connection.
I think it is you.
That as a citizen, we need to be cognizant of the fact, or at least the potential, that the media is trying to make us overly emotional while they are reporting the facts, because it is to their benefit.
I agree with that.
Let me just walk you through something here. I've got a screen share, and I just want to try to think through probabilities. Where I come from is I try to think through the incentives that are at play here. So I want to go over to my email here. Can you see this, Chris?
I can't, no.
Josh can, or wait. Let's see, I'm not, I need to screen share my whole screen here. My entire screen, yeah. Okay, hopefully this will work. All right, now can you see this?
There you go, yep.
Okay. So
wow, I'm on one of those rebel capitalist videos that I've watched so many of.
So in my mind, this is why I'm so leery of what the media, let's just say, may be trying to do. And this is why I've been so vocal, or one of the reasons I've been so vocal on Twitter, because you've seen the emotion, I've seen the emotion.
Sure.
And I think we can both agree that that's not good. So I titled this "What They Want," and this is just some simple notes. So if we look at the politicians, we know that their main priority is to get reelected.
Agree.
We know they've got some problems right now. Let's back up 2 weeks, 3 weeks. We know they've got some problems. Number one, inflation. Number two, COVID, because they're looking like idiots.
Correct.
It's becoming more and more well known that people like you and Chris Martenson and Eric Townsend, that the people that were spreading quote unquote disinformation 6 months ago are now the disinformation is now the science.
That's right.
It's becoming overly apparent. The truckers, obviously Trudeau had a huge problem with this, and I would argue most politicians did, because this was a movement that was going global. And you can see the compromising position that Trudeau is in. And then you can think about Biden. You can think about all these other political leaders saying, okay, what if we have a trucker movement here? What do we do? That I'm screwed.
Right.
That's going to jeopardize me being reelected, because it's going to put me in a very difficult position. We also know that they want power control. They want to restrict the freedoms without jeopardizing the fact that they can be reelected.
Sure.
So then you've got to think through, let's just say that we continue to push and we continue to escalate the emotion, therefore granting or supporting the U.S. getting involved in this war with Russia if it continues. Then what happens when you get, and I'm just using this as an example, you get nukes off the coast or submarines with nukes off the coast of the United States that are spotted. What would the American people allow the politicians to do if it got to this level of emotion as far as taking away their freedoms and liberties? And then we think about what the objectives are of the global elite, kind of the Davos crowd, the World Economic Forum. Well, they definitely want to take the U.S. down. They've said this many times. They don't like Russia. They want the United States dollar to be to no longer be the world reserve currency. They want a central bank digital currency backed by an SDR as the world reserve currency. They want a credit score. This gives them power. We can see this with Rogan. If there's a credit score, they wouldn't have to try to get Spotify to ban Rogan. They could just give him those demerits on the credit score. And then they want a lower population. Now, this sounds extreme until you really go over what they've said and kind of their belief system. And we've heard them talk about population growth going exponential to 2050. And so what people need to understand is that, and I've got a chart here, I don't need to pull it up, but you look at an exponential growth curve of population, you see energy use. They're on the exact same path, but at a certain point, the energy use has to flatline. It can't keep growing exponentially.
Right.
So what you have there is you've got a choice. Either you've got to come up with some other form of energy that is more dense than fossil,
Nuclear.
or you have to decrease the population, or you have,
Right.
that said, decrease consumption. Those are your only two levers. Okay, so I'm just stating this, and of course they want the power, the control. They want to micromanage the global economy, and this is part of their Great Reset agenda. So and then we also know that they've got the media to a certain degree. They influence, let's say, the media to a great degree.
Yeah.
But now let's look through this through the lens of war. Let's say that the United States does go to war with Russia, and this really starts to get super serious. That achieves or helps them achieve every one of these objectives.
I don't
Every single one.
I don't disagree with you. I don't disagree with you at
So
all.
but my point here is this is why I
Think I lost you.
George is in Colombia. His internet might have just cut out.
What's that?
Right now, he's in Colombia. His internet might have just cut out.
Yeah, I think that's probably what happened. Well, let me just say this. I don't know. Should I comment on what he just said? Is it worth it? We're gonna put this up.
You can finish your thoughts, and then I'll end it.
Okay. So, look, I don't disagree with what George is saying, that there is a political class and a global elite that wants to arrive at those endpoints. In fact, I think he's right. And, it's something that I talk about all the time. On my blog, Fringe Finance, I've written about all of those things. I've written about the great global monetary reset and how I think it's going to happen. I've written about the death of fiat. I've written about the power grab that came with COVID. I've written about why I thought common sense would end the COVID narrative this year and why the media would be forced to end the COVID narrative because it got to such a fever pitch. George and I agree on all of those things. So I'm not going to contest anything that he just said. What he is saying is this was a premeditated event, or the way that it's being reported is being directed by the global elites or by the deep state or whatever you want to call them in order to achieve those goals. And what I will argue is the opposite. I think that Putin did this now because he saw the world was in a precarious position. There's no doubt that he planned the time he was going to do this. And there's no better time to do this, maybe with China, maybe without China. There's no better time to do this than when the US is in an inflationary bubble, when the Fed has run out of options, when our debt is the highest it's ever been, when our productive capacity is the lowest it's ever been. I don't think there's any doubt that he picked this time and place to launch this invasion on purpose. And I think what I wrote about a couple days ago was I think ultimately he wants to bifurcate the global economy and create a global economy with China, where I think possibly China will back their currency with gold and they'll use that as a reserve currency. Russia will sell its oil, but will only accept rubles or gold-backed digital currency in order to be able to sell it. So we're not that far off. I just think that it's the other way around in this instance. I don't think that the media or that the politicians are yet looking to escalate this in order to achieve those goals. I think Putin picked this time and place to do this because we're in a precarious position. So this would be, betting the don't pass here. I'm kind of towing the U.S. intel line, right? There is no deep state line, even though we know there is. But for this specific instance, I think that this is because it is convenient, right? It's convenient that this happened when the U.S. it has this huge inflation problem that they can't get out of. And I've said on my podcast, and I've said before that, before the invasion happened, that I was kind of skeptical. Maybe they were just drumming up these headlines to, divert attention away from the US's inflationary crisis. Who knows? But George and I think we're coming to the same place, but from totally different spots, right? He wants to make sure that the media doesn't push us further down this slippery slope. He's arguing that, they might do that and that would serve the needs of politicians. And I don't necessarily disagree with him. I think it would serve the needs of politicians. The question is whether or not they truly want war. And there's been nothing to me that indicates that they want war yet. The media has, like I said, perpetrated perpetuated rather. They've definitely perpetrated, but they've perpetuated, a narrative of diplomacy and of peace so far. And I think to take this one instance that Poole did and say, just because it's being reported on that a German translator broke down crying at the atrocities of war and saying that we're purposely being manipulated into World War III is another slippery slope that you really, there's a big distance between those two statements, and you got to fill it up with some kind of evidence, even circumstantial evidence, to make that case. And so certainly I think politicians are always out to serve their best interests, their own interests. Certainly I think that the global elite want to grab power whenever possible. I don't disagree with anything that George said, but I just think in this instance, I think the nuances of the situation need to be examined on their own merits, as opposed to, like COVID, where we were just straight up lied to about things. I haven't seen any major lies yet. I haven't seen the major U.S. intelligence lie yet, if there's going to be one. So when we do see it, then we'll know. I get George's point. We don't want it to be too late before we examine things critically. And he's kind of saying that you don't want to give up any ground to emotion over reason, because you don't get that ground back once the elites kind of usurp power from it. And I get that, because I don't like parting with civil liberties for the same way. But I'm just seeing this instance a little bit differently than he is. And I think, again, to conclude, we want to get to the same place. We want peace. We want de-escalation. We want freedom. We want liberty. The path to get there, I think, is just kind of where we disagree a little bit. And I'd be interested in what George's take is on what we should do, if anything, in this situation, and then bat around those ideas, because it's easy to think about, ruining a hockey player's life because he didn't get a chance to get into the draft. But the reason that, people are getting emotional is that the reality of the situation is devastating for a lot of people in Ukraine. And that's delivered without any media spin, right? War is hell, and nobody wants war. And, the people in Ukraine, I have friends of friends that have, they have brothers, they have sisters, they have, family there. I mean, they're just like us. And so with COVID, oh, good, you're back, because I won't shut the fuck up. No, but I'm saying, like, with COVID, the media hysteria was apparent, and there was a hysteria. Notably, the hysteria peaked when we finally had the vaccines ready, and Rachel Walensky was on television saying, just now, I feel an impending feeling of doom. I'm not seeing that hysteria yet from the media. Maybe George is right, and it's coming, and it's on its way. But, I just don't see them there yet.
Yeah, I think that's kind of just where we differ, is I kind of see that.
Well, where do you see the hysteria?
Oh my gosh. Well, let's
Media
say
hysteria.
Well, the Simpsons, they did the Simpsons holding a Ukraine flag. If that's not propaganda, I don't know what is. They're showing pictures of the Statue of Liberty. And granted, it's the one in Europe or France or something, but that's got the Ukraine flag over it. I mean, this is, again, I'm not saying that this is inaccurate, but what I'm seeing is get you to feel something. So then the question becomes why? Why are they trying so hard? Why haven't they tried hard to do this in other things? I mean, let's remember that Saudi Arabia has been bombing the hell out of Yemen.
Right.
Very similar situation. Not exactly the same, granted, but very similar. So why aren't we seeing that plastered everywhere? Why aren't the
Sure.
Simpsons holding up signs of Yemen? It makes me just, I'm very skeptical, and I just want to, just
Well,
if I could go back here, because I think the way you get, if you, let's just suppose for a moment that you do want a war that benefits you. You know, how do you get people to agree with this? Well, you get them extremely emotional, like we were saying earlier. And when you go back to what we did with the Japanese or what the Germans did in the 1930s, this is how they got everyone to go along with things that otherwise would seem insane. And I think another thing that they try to do is they make the opponent try to appear weak. This is what you would do. Now, I'm not saying that the Russian army or Putin, I'm not saying they are not weak. I'm just saying if I was trying to achieve this objective, that's what I'd want them to seem appear, so people would be more receptive to the United States getting involved. And then we'd see oversimplification and we'd see a dehumanizing of Russians, which I think is obvious that we are seeing that. And again, I think it's going to get significantly worse.
is it possible that, look, you're talking about making the enemy look weak? I mean, is it possible that Ukraine is giving, the Ukrainian army was underestimated by Russia and they're just
Oh,
giving
yeah.
them hell?
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Okay. So
Absolutely.
then it becomes the
Absolutely.
question of, can it also, can something be the objective truth and the objective reality and also happen to be something that would check off a box in your world where, the global elite have this premeditated plan to usurp power?
Well, I don't know that, again, I want to be clear. I think it's a premeditated plan, but I think they're leveraging this crisis the same way that they leveraged the COVID, right?
But I don't see that yet. Where do you draw the analog? The
Well,
Simpsons holding up Ukrainian flags. Somebody asked me the other day, "Why'd you put a Ukrainian flag in your Twitter bio?" Because I put one in. It's the first time I ever changed my Twitter bio, right? And so people ask me, "Why'd you do that?" It doesn't do anything. It's just virtue signaling, and I said, "Look, well, I guess in some ways it contributes to a collective consciousness of psychological support for the Ukrainian people, and in some ways I think it contributes to collective awareness of the situation." I mean, how many times have you been on Twitter? I know it's happened to me where I see people put some dumb shit in their some emoji in their profile, and I'm like, I don't know what that means. I don't know what that means. I don't know what that means. And then eventually you find out, oh, it's like Worldwide Taco Day or something. So everybody's putting a taco in their thing. Oh, okay. So it contributes to the collective awareness of things, and it contributes to the collective psychological support for the Ukrainian people. You could make that argument too.
no, I'm not saying that's wrong. I want to be very clear. I'm not saying we shouldn't support or sympathize with the Ukrainian people. I'm saying that just particular focus on the media here. I've never in my life seen people this emotional about some sort of let's call it invasion. And another thing that bothers me, Chris, is I saw the same thing with Iraq, the exact same thing when the media, the United States media, did the same thing to Saddam Hussein and his sons. I remember specifically reading an article back then about Saddam Hussein's sons, how they were sitting in their palace of gold, lighting cigars with $100 bills. And I thought to myself, what does this have to do with the weapons of mass destruction?
Right.
You're trying to turn this into some sort of Mission Impossible movie,
Right.
where we've got
Yeah.
George Bush as Tom Cruise, and
Right.
you've got Saddam Hussein as XYZ bad guy. And it's I see the exact same things happening. And my thing here, what makes it different is why are we not focusing on Yemen? Why are we focusing on this so much to this degree? That makes me very suspicious. And then when I see the level of emotion on Twitter and other places, it makes me believe that not only is this their objective, but they're actually achieving their objective. Whether it is intentional or not, I guess that's open to debate.
I think you're right about Iraq. I wasn't really politically conscious enough when that was happening to have a serious opinion about it. I was, smashing beer cans on my forehead somewhere and trying to impress women. But but you're right. I mean, looking at it and looking back in history and trying to figure out whether or not we made the right or the wrong decision there. I mean, it's obvious that we made the wrong decision. And I just also want to say that somebody else pointed today that, the United States has been bombing, innocent people forever. Do you think that we should be held to the same standard as Russia? And I think yes. So I don't agree on, unprovoked killing of innocent civilians from anyone. And I think you're right about Iraq. That's what they made it out to be, right? And I think it was like this beef with Saddam dating back to George Bush Sr., where George Bush Jr., had this agenda like, they tried to kill my dad, so now I'm going to kill him, like this Texas kind of cowboy narrative that he's just going to go in there and, so they made up all this bullshit, Saddam Hussein has a laser beam that can fucking destroy the earth and all this dumb shit. So I agree with you there. I think your point's well taken. On the other hand, I think that this situation is totally different. I think this situation it's a completely different situation. You have an army of 150,000 people just deciding they just want to take a country.
Well, I'm talking specifically about the media. The media's portrayal.
Coverage, right? Yeah, but I'm just not like, and maybe I'm not watching enough media. Maybe that's the problem. Maybe you're watching things that I'm not. I've watched some of the coverage. I've watched, people like Condoleezza Rice and David Petraeus in the media making their comments, but everybody that's talking about it is trying to de-escalate the situation. I haven't seen any war hawks on TV saying we need to go and nuke Russia. We might be on the path to that narrative at some point, but look, with COVID, the media overshot the mark, right? So if the mark is 100%, the media went to fucking 400% with hysteria. Here, if the mark is 100%, I feel like the media, maybe they're at 110% or 120%. And what you're saying is you don't want it to get to 400% because by then they've whipped everybody up into such a frenzy that, the United States would justify vacating their civil rights and participating in the war. Right.
And they go along with it. They'd go along with anything. They go along with the central bank digital currency. They go along with absolutely anything.
Yeah, if you're scared shitless.
Out of their minds.
Yep. Fear is the way to do that. You're right. So, me and you are on the same page with a lot of that stuff.
Yeah, I think that is really where we differ is you don't see that in the media to the degree to which I do. And that's really, I think, and then I think we have some slight differences on, the solution to the problem.
What do you think we should do?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think it starts with understanding that this is a wildly complex situation. And it also starts, I was listening to Russell Brand the other day, and he's got some very interesting insights. He's kind of a crazy guy, but he articulates kind of his thoughts well. And he said that to understand or explain is not to condone. And people really struggle with that because I think we all need to start by understanding what is Putin's motive. Is it that he is just some psychotic, crazy person like one of these Genghis Khan types? And even if he is, what is his argument? Like, why? What are they saying? And then what are the Russian people that support him saying? And then what are the Russian people who are not? What are they saying? And how far back does this go? Does this go back 10 years? Does this go back 100 years?
Right.
And if so, let's try to really wrap our minds. Jeez. Are you still there, Chris?
Yes, I am.
For some reason, my camera went out. I'm sorry. So I'll just keep
going. That.
But let's just try to really understand this as objectively as possible, even if we disagree, because then we start to understand the nuance. Once we start to understand the nuance, then we start to understand what we could do. How could there be a compromise that Putin may agree with and the other Ukrainians may agree with? Even within Ukraine, you've got all of these different groups of people, these different ethnicities, these different belief systems. And, how can we come to the table and figure out a path that there's definitely compromise here, but where we may be able to set a path forward that doesn't lead to the annihilation of the entire world.
Right.
And I think that's a starting place. But my fear, going back to the emotion, is that people will get so emotional that they won't even consider that to be an option.
Right. And I think that's a good fear to have. I think that's, I think that it's smart to think like that. So I don't necessarily disagree with you. I think we just disagree on what part of, how much hysteria there is now versus how much is just facts being reported. And war
Yeah.
is hysterical to begin with, right?
Yeah.
People cramming onto trains to get the hell out of Kiev, missiles hitting hospitals, people dying, innocent people dying, civilians taking up arms to defend themselves. I mean, the harsh realities of war on their own, objectively, uh, carry with them some hysteria. The question is, how much are we overshooting the mark? And there hasn't been, for me, a preponderance of the evidence like there was with COVID that we are overshooting that mark yet. And that doesn't mean that you're not right, that it's not a slippery slope to get us there. And certainly any crisis will be used to abscond with our civil liberties and to take power and to implement all these, generally uncool things that we talk about: social credit score, digital currency, etc. So I think you're right about all that. The question is, right now, are our actions proper relative to the risk that we face? And I agree with your point that we need to have everything on the table in order to understand those things. It's like an investment. If you're long a company, I want to hear the best case against owning it, because I
Right.
need to make
Right.
sure that I know every possible thing about it before I make my decision. And if I'm short it, I want to know why the biggest holder owns the stock. What's the bull case, right? And so I think your points are 100% right and 100% accurate. And I think our disagreements are on this very thin line that, revolves around what actions are appropriate and what actions aren't appropriate.
Yeah, and to use your point with investing, when you're thinking through whether to buy, sell, or hold, the last thing you want to do is allow the media to influence your
Correct.
decision one way or the other. And I think
Correct.
that's really the bottom line here is if if I'm my observations are correct, or if your observations are correct, that's not really the point. The point for, I think, the viewers and the listeners is to be cognizant of the potential for the media to influence, or the politicians to
Right.
influence your decision. Always be skeptical and make sure that you are using critical thinking,
Right.
because and rational and reason, because
Right.
we're dealing with a situation here that is very, very, very serious, and we all need to realize that.
I agree, and I just think that there is I think what set us off on our disagreement this morning, and certainly one of the things that I took exception with, was, again, it boils down to this fact of who is overreacting. To equate sanctions being placed on Russia and all the things that the modern world has collectively decided they're going to do to try to, pressure Russia without entering into a war, to equate that with the lobotomized idiocy of cancel culture, the analog just didn't make sense in my
No,
head.
what I was referring to specifically with the cancel culture tweet was them considering banning the Russian students from universities,
Right.
with them banning the performers in New York, and them banning, if you want to use that as a term, the young 16, 17-year-old hockey players that are trying out for this Canadian Hockey League. And we're seeing it now. They're deleting the Russian team from the FIFA soccer game, the video game.
Right.
Uh, and I think it's going to get more extreme, but that's what I was referring to specifically.
Well, and if it does, then let's meet again and talk about it, and we can, continue to assess the scenario as it develops, because it's obviously extremely dynamic and it changes every couple minutes, if not, every hour. And so we could be in a totally different position in a week from now, where, you're conceding to me that you're wrong, or I'm conceding to you that I was wrong. It's all going to depend on how things play out and what the media's reaction is to it. And, I think we both just we both want peace, and we both want de-escalation, and we both want freedom, and we both want liberty, and we both want the same things. And so, I'm just thankful that we can talk about it and have a discussion about it.
Well, I think that's probably the biggest takeaway for people, is that in today's day and age, we need to promote healthy discussion, even
Yes.
when there are two people that have opposing views. And this is something that we have lost, especially as of the last 2 years. And we have to realize how important this is moving forward.
I agree. And that's how I knew that you were going to accept my invitation to talk about it today, because we don't really disagree on much. And, when we do, I think it's so important to hash it out. So, kudos to you for saying, all right, making time. I know you're way busier than I am, for making time and talking it out. So.
Yeah, well, thanks for coming on, Chris. For the viewers and listeners who were patient enough with my horrible Wi-Fi connection to still be watching us right now, we got 830 of them. Where can they check you out? I know you've got the QTR podcast. I listen to almost every episode, and you've got a Substack. You want to tell us where we can find that?
No, it's okay. Sign up for Rebel Capitalist Pro.
Come on, Chris.
It's no problem. Look, the important thing today is that we both got to say what we want to say about an extremely important developing story, the consequences of which. What's that?
What's your Substack?
It's called Fringe Finance. QTR's Fringe Finance. You can find it. I'm out there.
You can check that out. And
I'm around town.
Yeah. One thing that you may find interesting is I had a discussion yesterday with Jesse Felder, and he's a huge Jim Rogers fan, like I am. So we were trying to think through what would Jim Rogers do right now, with as far as from an investment standpoint with Russia. And so I won't, spoil the what we discussed, or I won't let the cat out of the bag there. But I had my assistant reach out to Jim Rogers today, so hopefully I'll get him on next week to try to pick his brain on how he'd be thinking through this.
In lieu of promoting my own stuff, let me promote an interview that Felder did with Palisades Gold Radio a couple weeks ago. You should listen to that, even though some of the analysis obviously would differ now that the geopolitical landscape has changed. And also, Luke Groman did an interview with Palisades Gold Radio. It's like 2 podcasts ago, talking about the potential economic implications if Russia decides to only, accept the ruble or accept gold for oil, and explaining all the leverage that Putin has here. Luke Groman's interview, must listen. Avoid my blog, listen to Luke Groman. That's what I would say on Palisades Gold Radio. All right, George, I got to go. Love you.
All right,
big kiss. Bye.
Bye.